Friends, welcome to yet another video in our series Finance and Investing Tidbits. The theme of this video, friends, is why is the 2008 crisis called as the subprime crisis and how did it unfold? Now, 13-14 years have passed since then. So the question is, why should we linger in the history? It was a fascinating turn of events. Of course, those who went through it, of course, had a lot of suffering. But those kinds of events actually teach us a lot, and they also tell us how we need to be more careful in our own investing journey, as well as how businesses uh, work on certain assumptions which may not hold good. So some of those aspects provide us enormous learning, and therefore I thought of creating this video. Welcome to this video. So 2008 crisis was marked by many banks in US getting into trouble. They actually were shadow banks. In the Indian context, we call them as non-banking finance companies. So many of them did not have a formal banking license, but they were shadow banks because they used to do businesses which would resemble that of a bank, and they had a systemic kind of involvement in the US economy, which was very significant, and therefore if any of them was in trouble, it would also spill over into the entire banking system. But that was not all. The impact of the crisis reached the shores of Europe too, because in the name of diversification, particularly global diversification, European banks had also got exposure to certain US assets. And as those assets became toxic, the European banks also suffered. But we must remember that the seeds of this crisis were sown much earlier, several years earlier. So let's explore what happened. Now, there is a certain psychological aspect here because many banks and institutions are listed on the stock market. And we all know that there are analyst calls after every quarter results, and the analysts grill the management in terms of the next steps and plans and how the growth is going to happen. Now, while listing shares in the stock market has a lot of its merit from the perspective of value creation, uh, but the quarter after quarter scrutiny also sometimes brings what is called as short-termism. So the management gets focused on the short term because they need to deliver growth quarter after quarter. Otherwise, the market can really beat that particular stock down. So out of that fear, the managements also sometimes take steps which are very good in the short term, but which can be damaging in the long term. So initially, the banks in the US lent to the prime borrowers, people who had excellent credit history, were professionals, executives, entrepreneurs, and they had excellent credit rating. So they were all prime borrowers. Now, obviously, every bank would chase them and, kind of entice them to borrow money and put that into assets like houses, what they call in the US as mortgages, right? In other words, the property is mortgaged to a bank. Now, when real estate prices rise, when you borrow money, it actually pays you handsomely because you invest a very small amount in the house, you borrow lots of money, and the property price is appreciating. When property price is appreciating, the lender, the bank, does not benefit from that appreciation, but the borrower benefits. So, uh, with rising real estate prices, borrowers went for additional real estate investments out of these borrowings. Naturally, with increasing demand, the prices began to rise further. And this looks like a wonderful, investment because you put a very small personal savings into it and you borrow lots of money. The appreciation belongs to the owner of the house, the equity owner, and that provides a phenomenal return on that small equity investment in the house. Just as an example, if your house is worth 100 rupees and you have borrowed 90 rupees and 10 rupees is your own savings and 100 becomes 130, then that 90 doesn't grow, 90 remains steady. In fact, it starts getting repaid. So the whole benefit of increasing the house price comes to this equity owner, the house owner who has put in just 10. So that magnifies the return and therefore more money starts flowing into real estate. Now the question is, from the bank's perspective, where would the loan growth come from once the prime borrowers were exhausted? So obviously they had to start compromising on the credit quality. So the best of the professionals were exhausted. Then you start looking at lower rungs of professionals who may not be doing so well, whose salary may not be grand, whose income may not be grand. Their family responsibilities from a financial perspective could be quite daunting. But you do a compromise and start lending to them. Now, it did not matter much as the property prices were rising. So even if a borrower were to default, the bank could always recover the loan because the property prices would be far beyond the loan amount. So it was a win-win situation both from the borrower's perspective as well as from the bank's perspective. But then when even that set of borrowers were exhausted, banks had to hunt for growth. So they even started lending those who were unemployed. They were living on doles, but banks didn't care. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, one assumption went completely wrong, and that assumption was that the property prices would always keep on rising. But a stage comes when they plateau, and then when they start falling, there could be far bigger challenges. Finally, property prices going up is just an assumption, not a reality. People start thinking linearly. They think that the property prices are just going to go up and up. They forget that every market has cycles. So what has gone up is likely to come down. So property prices peaked in the US in 2006 and then began correcting. They started falling. So naturally, as they started falling, and some people who were actually on the margin in terms of their ability to repay, they started defaulting, and then these properties were repossessed from defaulting borrowers, and naturally they had to be sold by the bank to recover the loan, because anyway the borrower who was a subprime borrower did not have the ability to comfortably repay. So the supply increased in the market further, resulting in further fall. So this fall further got accentuated, and even people who were better than people living in doles in terms of credit quality, they also came to this point where their outstanding loan and the property price, they were too close for comfort. So this created a further panic kind of situation. Finally, a stage came in 2008 where the outstanding mortgage loans, to the extent they were more than property prices. So those transactions where the mortgage loan amount was more than the property price was almost 1/4 of the loans. You can imagine 25% of the loans had this problem where the loan amount was more than the property value. So even if that property were to be repossessed, the bank would not be able to recover. And then they had to start making provision for those losses. So it naturally created a major question mark on the health of the banks. So much that they did not trust each other when it came to lending money, and markets stalled due to trust deficit. So the assumption that US markets are very liquid, in other words, at any point of time you will find a seller and a buyer or a lender and a borrower, that assumption again went completely haywire, and there was stalling of these markets. The liquidity dried up due to trust deficit. Nobody knew exactly what the other bank's position would be, and that panic created a complete stall in the market. Some banks like Lehman Brothers went belly up, since they had invested in long-term assets to generate superior returns out of short-term borrowings which were relatively cheaper. But this resulted into a major asset liability mismatch. And as markets stalled, they could not repay the earlier borrowings out of fresh borrowings because nobody was willing to lend to anybody else. The US government and Federal Reserve had to take some steps to capitalize the other banks and save them from a failure and that creating a systemic impact. They also bought toxic assets from the market to make the markets flowing again. While US acted decisively, the problem lingered in Europe for many years. It provides some valuable lessons to us, both in our own personal investing and in terms of the care that is required to be taken when one is dealing with assets which are subject to market cycles and fluctuations. If you have liked this video, feel free to share it. Thank you so much.